Hello, welcome to a new episode of Cultivate, our Evergreen podcast. And today we're doing something a little different. We're at our Evergreen annual meeting in Salt Lake City, and we're going to interview one of our guest speakers, Reverend Dr. Lauren Ng. And I'm really excited about this. It's weird for me to even say that because we're good friends, Lauren, and just to call you Reverend Doctor is kind of funny for me. But you're a good friend of mine. I think we have a lot of interesting similarities in ministry and in our past. But before I get into all of that, I thought it'd be nice if you could maybe introduce yourself a little, and for those who don't know us, listeners, and tell us a bit of what you're up to.
Well, from one Reverend Doctor to another Reverend soon-to-be Doctor, so that's very exciting. So as you said, my name is Lauren Ng, and maybe I'll start where I am now, and then we can go backwards. Right. So currently serving as Senior Program Officer at the Berkeley School of Theology in Berkeley, California, and my role there is to direct or run the Lilly Endowment-funded grant program that we've called the ARC Initiative. It's part of Lilly's Thriving Congregations Initiative. And so at BST, Berkeley School of Theology, we're calling it the ARC Initiative. And it's congregational formation and leadership formation for Asian American leaders in churches. And so I can get into a little more later what that looks like. But I just started there on June 1st. So it's October now, so it's still pretty fresh. But very excited. I graduated from Berkeley School of Theology when it used to be called American Baptist Seminary of the West with my Master of Divinity back in 2005. So for me, it's a bit of a coming home to be back at the institution.
Now, you've been very active all throughout the whole denomination nationally, right? The American Baptist Church. Maybe you could, we probably don't have enough time to say everything, but maybe you could give us a brief synopsis of just like what you've done before.
Born and bred, baby, born and bred.
Right.
So it was funny because we were just having lunch upstairs here at this Evergreen meeting, and somebody asked me at my table, so when did you get started with ABC? And I said, well, kind of at birth, because my father is a retired American Baptist clergy, and he worked at the national headquarters at what was then called Educational Ministries, Christian Education, back in 1978. And I was born the year that my parents moved to Pennsylvania from California for him to take that job. So literally born and raised in Pennsylvania because of American Baptists. So I have worked at, most recently, the American Baptist Home Mission Societies. I served as Director of Leadership Empowerment there. Ran a program called the Co-Creators Incubator that supports missional entrepreneurs doing innovative ministries outside of local church, out of traditional church models. I've also served on the development staff for international ministries. I have been on a couple of different boards and served on like an advisory group for American Baptist Women in Ministry. So biennial program committee planning for several biennials. Chaired the committee for the Rhode Island Providence biennial back in the day. So definitely been in and around Baptist circles. I love the ABC and have felt God calling me to commit my life and ministry to serving alongside my siblings in our denomination. So.
Yeah, and I feel like you've lived maybe 4 lifetimes worth of a normal person, like just how much you've done.
The gray hair is definitely, I can attest to that.
It's really incredible, like how prolific you are and like where your leadership has gone. I mean, I think we could spend a lot of time about that. But I want to get back to the ARC Initiative because this is something, as a fellow Asian American that I'm very interested in. Tell us a bit about the ARC Initiative and like how you're going to be reaching out to AAPI people.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the Lilly initiative, Thriving Congregations, is not in any way limited to Asian Americans. It was really Berkeley School of Theology in deep partnership with the Alliance of Asian American Baptist Churches as well, who said, we're recognizing this as an opportunity, that being the only American Baptist institution, a theological institution on the West Coast, and being here in in Northern California, where many Asian Americans can trace their immigrant story or lineage back to the port of San Francisco, for example, not all, but many, that we really had an opportunity there to come alongside Asian American churches and their leaders in this formational process. And so that was the proposal written to Lily, and thankfully they saw a lot of potential and value in that, and so here we are. So the way that we've sort of structured the ARC initiative is, first we started by gathering an advisory group, and you sit on that advisory group, which we're very happy about. Several others do as well, and representing a bunch of different Asian American ethnicities and also geographical locations up and down the west or western side of the country. And we're offering 3 modules as part of the ARC initiative. One is a storytelling kind of workshop experience where we invite Asian American leaders and congregational teams to really start to mine for or receive a framework for how they can begin to mine for and tell their own personal stories, family stories, congregational stories, and then how they can really be in touch with their own stories in order to discern how God is calling us and inviting us for such a time as this, right, in the current moment we find ourselves in. Especially coming out of COVID and the, again, rise of anti-Asian American Pacific Islander rhetoric. Certainly wasn't the first time that's happened in our nation, but the most recent time. And we kind of put forth this thesis that in order for Asian American Christians to respond faithfully in this moment, we need to understand the fullness of how we got here, how God's story has been threaded in and through us from our ancestors to where we are now. So it's really about a coming home to and a revisiting those stories. The second module is a pilgrimage, so an actual 2-day bus tour being led by Professor Russell Jung out of San Francisco State. And we're going to get on charter buses and we're going to visit sites of historical significance to Asian American Christians throughout the greater Bay Area. And then the third module is at BST, we have an intercultural leadership certificate course. And so we'll be inviting Asian American leaders and actually in church teams to identify a non-Asian American congregation in their neighborhood, in their community, whether it's a Euro church or an African American or Black church or Latino church and Native church. And together they would send, pairs or teams into this intercultural leadership certificate coursework. And then at the culmination, the sort of capstone project of that is that they will work together to design, ideate on some type of community project together. And we have seed grants available to help mobilize and actualize those projects. So Asian American churches in the greater Bay Area to start, and hopefully we'll expand geographically after that, have an opportunity to sign up for one of those modules, 2 or all 3. Yeah. And we're going to be offering those starting in 2025, the summer of 2025, and then again for 3 more years after that, because it's a 5-year grant. And then the other piece running kind of concurrently with all that is something you're working on with me, and that is the ARC Fellowship for Young Creatives. Yeah. So we are looking at Asian Americans between 18 and 29 years of age who identify as creatives or artists. And that Fellows program is going to have its own kind of framework over the course of several months as a cohort together, but also culminates in sort of a capstone of identifying an issue that each young adult is passionate about in their communities and designing some type of response to that, whether it's a creative expression, artistic expression, or some other type of project. So really excited, since you and I both identify as creatives. We're not certainly not 18 to 29 years old anymore, but excited to be working with those young adults.
You could be.
Oh, well, thank you. Those are very nice.
Well, I want to focus, because you'd mentioned we're both creatives, and for some of them who don't know, you're a writer and a poet. And one of these modules that you're talking about is storytelling. Yeah. And I was just wondering, if you want to talk more about this idea of why is storytelling so important, but especially for API people living in a minority culture in the times that we're in now. What is it about storytelling that could be so helpful to our spirituality and our identity.
Yeah. I love stories so much that I named my middle child Story. So her name's actually Story, Story. And when I was in college, I was a creative writing major, and my senior poetry collection was named Storyteller. That's how it was titled. So, I mean, we're people of story, people of faith, as God's people. The way our faith tradition is passed down is through stories, right? Jesus taught with stories, parables. And so it's very much integral to our faith tradition. And so, but I think for a lot of people who find themselves to the side of the margins or outside of the center, we often compartmentalize the stories of our faith, so to speak, which for people of color in the United States often have inherited a highly colonized faith as well. So we tell these faith stories, but we're left kind of on our own to figure out how to connect with them in a way that honors and reflects and mirrors our ethnicities as well. And then we sort of separate that from some of the stories that we've been told from our family traditions, the things that have been passed down there. And so I think the ARC initiative and other programs out there are really helping us kind of bridge that gap, and to see that God's story in and through us invites all of who we are, right? Invites the dimensions of us that are about our faith, and those that are about our lineage, and those that are about our culture and the values therein. And I'm hoping as well that through some of these types of programs like the ARC Initiative, we can help one another to not be afraid of some of the stories that we feel have traditionally been cast aside or outside of our faith tradition. A lot of us have family members and ancestors who did not identify as Christian and worshipped either another deity or another type of faith or practice. And those stories are vital and important, and we still carry the values and the experiences and the learnings from those spiritual practices and traditions in our bones. And I think we don't do a service to ourselves or the magnitude of who our Creator is when we try to silence those or push those aside or hide them. I think those can continue to be unearthed and incorporated into how we see ourselves today.
I think that's a really great point, because when we're talking about stories, I'm just thinking of my experience as like a second generation Asian American. My parents were immigrants. It felt like stories were sort of like imposed upon us. And when I was coming to North America, like when my family came to North America, this is the story you must adopt, right? When I went to school, this is the story I must adopt. So like, it was a very this wave of stories, and I felt like I had no choice about it. But this whole thing that you're talking about is really interesting, because it's saying like we have this agency, right? We can receive stories, but we can also reject them. Right. But we can also like not feel like we have to reject the whole thing. Like we can even discern through them, like fine, there's good parts of this story, some parts of the story don't resonate with me. Right. And then the biggest revelation, I think, for a lot of minority people is that we can create our own stories, and our stories are just as important, just as, quote, valid, whatever that means, as the other stories around us. And so, honestly, I wish I had that kind of mentorship, because growing up, I felt like I was just given all these stories, and I was just trying to hold them, and I was like, these don't fit me. I don't really like these stories, but I feel like I have no choice,
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think there's a lot of freedom in recognizing that when you said, we can create our own stories, that stories can be big, they can be small, they can be about a moment in time, they can be about a season of life. And I think as we can free ourselves up and free one another up as well to say, you may not feel like you have a story to tell, but you do. And the smallest thing that might even feel inconsequential to you right now, when amplified, when shared in community, may have a lot more meaning and significance in not only your life, but for others than you may think. That being said, one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time kind of thinking about and writing about is the value of silence, and that silence can be story in and of itself. And so what I'm kind of organizing my thoughts around at the moment is that we live in a very tell-all culture. Dominant culture says that we can't build authentic relationships with someone unless we know everything about them. And we dig for all the dirt, and we try to uncover every stone and roll over every stone. And so we value, again, that sort of tell-all disclosure culture. And coming from Asian American culture, Chinese culture in my case, there's a lot that's not told. There's a lot that is kept hidden, and there's a lot that is buried. And again, in dominant culture, we can run the risk of saying, well, let's go uncover those. Right? The value is in taking the things my ancestors hid and shining light on them. And what I'm kind of wrestling with right now is the idea that maybe not. Is that a colonized way of thinking?
Yeah.
And can silence be a story in and of itself? And can we see that silence is not always an act of violence, but an act of gentleness and sacrifice and love? And so there are reasons why some of the pain and trauma that my grandparents and my own parents have experienced have not been passed down to me as stories. And maybe that's okay. Right? So that's sort of what I've been thinking about a lot lately and writing poems about and articles about. And
wow, that's there's a lot to that. Because like silence is also the space for questions, right? And asking questions in the way is that we don't necessarily have to answer them.
That's right.
But just allowing them to be sitting in the silence. Because whatever that will generate in the silence is worth it in itself.
Right.
And when you're talking, I totally was thinking about how we're so obsessed with content and data in this generation, but content and data don't mean stories.
They don't.
And I think that's what people confuse a lot, is that as long as we just get all the research, the observations, the content, the data, we have an identity. It's like, no, there's no identity going on. Identity only really gets formed through like the stories of journeys, right? The stories of communities, right? And that's much greater than content. And I love, so what you're talking about, the silence, it totally makes sense to me.
Yeah, because the facts or whatever, right, is the data, the information you're saying, and then the synthesis of it is maybe like the narrative of, like, okay, so now I can synthesize that and kind of connect that information with this information and see a bit of a thread, see what might be being formed or shaped from that data, now that I'm kind of putting like with like and contrasting things. And then the story is like the art of it, almost, right? It's like, and then how do you communicate that? And it's not to say we can't have stories inside our own hearts and minds, and that they can be stories there too, even if never shared. But I feel like the art of storytelling is then taking that information, the data, the synthesis of it, and then finding a way to communicate it so that it's received. And it's going to be received differently by everyone who hears it or reads it, but
Well, this kind of brings me to think about another thing, is that, I'm a creative, like I'm an artist. I do mostly music, but I feel like for both of us, we don't just do one kind of art, right? Like you also are in a band, right? With your husband, Whisper Fight. And
thanks for the plug.
Yes, you should check them out.
You can be our 25th listener on Spotify. My mom, my dad. And
no, it's okay. I'm the same with my stuff. So, but I find when I meet with other multidisciplinary artists, there's not a moment where you're thinking, okay, this art, this is where it begins and this is where it ends, right? There's not this clear line of okay, I'm not doing poetry anymore, now I'm writing song lyrics, right? It all just kind of is from the same well, right? And I was thinking, I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel like also ministry is also another creative extension. And there's this interesting, when you kind of talk about art, it was like a capital A, I feel like all of it sort of comes from the same place. This idea of creating, taking stuff beyond just raw tools of data and content or whatever, and then it transforms into art, that's kind of sublime transcendence. I was wondering what your thoughts are about that relationship that you have with creativity, ministry, and just generating things.
Yeah, well, I agree with you 100% that it's the lines are permeable, and it's more about something that is being birthed, that you feel like God has given you to put out into the world, that should exist in the world. And the medium or the format is sort of up for grabs, right? But it's this needs to be born. The work that I'm doing with the ARC initiative at BST is very exciting for me because I like to create programs and build initiatives. And so I did that with the co-creators at American Baptist Home Mission Societies. And now at BST, it was like, great, here's the proposal we did, and here's sort of the framework and what we said we would do. And now go ahead, get some wonderful, brilliant minds together and build the thing. And that is so fun for me. And so I feel like ministry as creative expression as a way of saying, okay, here's the need I see, here's the opportunity I see, here's the feedback I'm receiving, here are the resources and assets we have as an institution. Let's put all of this together and see if we can offer something of meaning and value. And then it's still a very iterative process, right? Because then we'll try this out next year. And as people prayerfully participate and say, we see, oh, that worked really well, that might need to be modified or adjusted, it's this constant process. And I feel like that's the way it is with art as well. I mean, I had a creative writing professor at Oberlin College who always said every poem is a draft. So even when you get it published by somebody and it's printed on a page, like she said, I have printed poems that I've gone back and revised. And so I feel like that with music as well, right? We'll record something as a band, get in the studio, it's released as a single, but every time we play that thing live, we rewrite it in some ways, right? And that's the beauty of art. It really can't be contained, and it requires that that constant dialogue and that constant exchange, so that it's continually relevant to people.
Yeah, I think like that reminds me a lot of like kind of like Genesis 1 of like when God just says, "Let there be," and it starts off with like these fundamental things, right, with like light and dark, but it keeps generating and it keeps changing and evolving. And
that's the first thing we learn about God in our scriptures, is that God is a creator.
Right.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's just what we do. And like what you're doing with the ARC is just like you're using the raw tools of the grant and putting together like the resources you have to generate something that's in your heart. Same with your poetry. I love that. And with me too, like music, like I'm often just like working on sound design, just like textures. And then they just start to begin to form. And then there's this weird thing is that when you stop feeling like you have to be the one in control and like you're more like following the journey, let's see where it goes, it gets really fun.
It does get really fun.
Because like you don't know, right? Like we're talking about plans, we're talking about art projects, but we don't really know until the end it happens. And then even when it's quote released, it's still going ahead, right? We might remix it, we might, the project might change, you get funding from something else. And I feel like that's a really helpful understanding of ministry too. It's like you never arrive, right? It's just kind of like following the, the creator God, right? The spirit, and just saying like, okay, God, where next, right?
I mean, if each of us is only one part of the body, right? There's no way we're going to create the full thing, and that's liberating in a way as well. And so art is actually a exercise in humility, I think. I think a lot of times we see, artists who are, have gallery, installations in a gallery and they're well-renowned and all that. And it's like, but there can feel like there's a lot of conceit, related to art. But I think that art is actually a very humbling experience because like you said, it's constantly reshaping itself. I mean, even in the songwriting process, like I will write a song and be like, this is the mood, this is sort of the atmosphere I'm looking for, this is the tonality. And then I'll put bass line and lyrics, and then I'll pass it to Daniel and he'll add drums. And then we'll pass it to John who adds guitars. And I'm like, so not only is it a completely different vibe, I think the time signature should be different. And it's this whole other thing. And at the end of it, I sit back and I go, wow, I could never have done that alone. The beautiful thing that it is right now, thank goodness I had co-creators as part of that process. And same goes for ministry.
It really is like a discipline of relinquishing, I guess, right? It's just like trusting that when you let it go, the creative energy of whatever it was is like will continue. And that's really hard. I think one of the biggest obstacles I think to creativity is like fear, right, and control, right? The colonizing spirit, right? Because that's a lot of what it comes from. So I feel like if we can kind of move our art or ministry, like all the things that we do in life, out of those spirits of fear and control, like we open ourselves up to so much more possibility.
Yes, exactly. We can practice control in other ways that are like I'm a pretty orderly person. So for me, it's like my jigsaw puzzles. No touchy. right? So I have my 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle that's always out on my card table every month of the year. And all, I mean, thankfully, no one else in my family, my kids and my husband really don't like jigsaw puzzles.
That's funny.
But I'm like, don't mess with my piles, right? So I get, because God is a God of order too.
Okay.
So that's in us intrinsically as
Yes,
well. And
yes.
so I get my order and my control in the places where it's healthy to do so.
Right.
Well, Lauren, I feel like we could probably talk for forever because whenever we talk, we're always generating something else. I actually have 5 more thoughts, but this is a good spot to pause and a good reason to bring Lauren back for another podcast episode.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your time.
You're
I'm
welcome. Thanks
really
for having me.
glad that you're our guest speaker for the annual meeting. And we're just grateful for everyone who visits this podcast. Make sure that you subscribe. Stay tuned. There's a lot of great guests to come. And thank you for journeying with the Evergreen Association. We'll talk to you next time.